Hey, 8th grade. So today we're going to be looking at writing our compare and contrast paragraphs. If we look at our writing prompt, this week you have read 3 articles discussing bias. Write an essay analyzing the author's purpose in each article and compare the way information is presented in each article. Use evidence from each text to support your answer. So we're really going to be focusing on this second part, which is to compare the way that information is presented. We've already identified our author's purpose, and we've already identified how each author presents information, but now we have to go and look at those similarities and differences. So if we look at this chart, we have our 3 articles. And what is the topic that all 3 of these articles share? That's right, they're all talking about bias. So all 3 articles talk about bias, which is another word for prejudice or when one side is being favored. But the way that each author talks about bias is a little bit different. So in A Teen in a Trolley reveals society's dark side. How is information presented to the reader so that you understand what bias is or how bias is being explored? Good. So this author describes an experiment that Tiffany does on bias. What about in the blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise? So again, our author describes an experiment that Jane Elliott does with her class on bias. So both A Teen in a Trolley reveals society's dark side and the blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise talk about bias through the steps of an experiment and the results of an experiment by describing it. However, in Little Things Are Big, our Jesus Colon article, how is the information on bias presented? Good. It's presented through a personal narrative or a personal story about bias that Jesus Colon experienced. So what we have here is a list of some compare and contrast words that we can use to show similarities and differences. So on our left side, we have our compare words. These are ways that we can show that 2 texts are alike or the way the information being presented is alike. Whereas on the right side, we have our contrast words, which are going to show the differences or how they're different. Now, using these words in your compare and contrast paragraph is going to be necessary, but it's kind of hard sometimes to figure out exactly how to use them correctly. So what I did here is gave you some sentence starters that are going to help you get started. Now, you do not need to use these sentence starters, but they are a way to kind of see how these compare and contrast sentences work. So for example, if you're comparing in both blank, so that would be either the name of the article or the name of the author in both authors, in both blank and blank, blank. So in both A Teen in a Trolley reveals society's dark side and the blue-eyed and brown-eyed experiment or exercise, what happens? The authors present information using experiments or present information on bias using experiments. So here we have a contrast sentence starter. On one hand, Brookshire, which is the author of the Teen and Trolley article, does this, while the author of the blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise does this, or gives us this type of a bias versus this type of bias. So this is a way of comparing and contrasting between articles. Another way is to say that the articles differ because, how are they different? And here's another compare. In blank, information on bias is presented using blank, similarly to blank, which also uses blank. So in the blue-eyed, brown-eyed exercise, information on bias is presented using an experiment, similarly to A Teen in a Trolley reveals society's dark side, which also uses experiments. So what's important is that you give at least one way that all 3 articles have similarities, at least one way that the articles are different, and then I would say add in some details about each article that's going to help to compare and contrast. So not just that they both use experiments, but then what's different about those experiments? Or not just that all 3 are about bias, how is that information on bias different? So there's some space for you to do your rough draft compare and contrast paragraph. And I also wanted to draw attention to our rubric that is in your packet. So once you write your compare and contrast paragraph, all you'll have left is your conclusion paragraph, which can be 1, 2, maybe 3 sentences that restates what you proved, uses your title and or your author, maybe a strategy to leave the reader wanting more or giving a little anecdote. But you should use this rubric to go through your entire essay and make sure that you have given the author's purpose of each article with background information and then compare and contrast it the way that information is presented. So go ahead and get started writing your rough draft to compare and contrast the way that information is presented in each article. If you have any questions, raise your hand. Good luck.